I hope that you managed to complete the challenge. Now here goes the solution. So once more we start from an empty CodePen project, and I will start with the markup here once again. So let's call this container a challenge. And so now let's put our elements in there. So the first one is the header. The next one I'm gonna call the small box 1. So small box 1, and then actually 3 of them. And I could have done that with Emmet, like I showed you before in the other lecture, but it's only 3 boxes, so it's not too hard. Then the next one is called the main content. Then we have the sidebar, and of course finally the footer. Okay, so moving over here to our CSS now. Let's format our challenge element. So let's set like some overall settings like we did before for this container, like giving it a width and a margin of, again, 30 pixels top bottom, and then auto, just so that it sits nicely centered here in our viewport, okay? Then let's actually give a background color to all of these elements here, okay? And how do we do that? How do we select all of them at the same time? Well, I just like to do it like this, as I showed you before many times in the course. So basically we select all of the direct children of the challenge. So using this SAS selector here. So challenge and then direct children and all of them, right? Remember that? So background color, and again I'm going with the orange red, okay. A padding of 20 pixels, let's say. Color should be white. Font size of 30 pixels and the font family, just a sans serif one. So we don't want to bother with incorporating some font here, okay? Just so that it looks a bit better than the original. So this is our layout, let's say, without any of the styling. Now remember that we had 4 columns basically. So 1 for each of these small boxes, and then 1 on the side for the sidebar, right? So grid, template, rows. And if you remember, we also had 4 rows. And the size I gave them was this one. So 100 pixels for the first one, so for the header. Then 200 pixels for the small boxes. Then 400 pixels for the main content. And 100 pixels again for the footer. And then grid template. Columns. Remember that the sidebar was a bit smaller than the rest of the columns. And so what we want is basically to have 3 equally sized columns and then 1 smaller one. So the way I'm going about this, and you can probably guess, is to have 3 times 1 fractional unit and then the last column with, let's say, 200 pixels. And so the sidebar will have this 200 pixels, of course, and then the rest of the space will be divided for the 3 other columns and the gutter, of course, that we have. Now what's missing here, you probably already noticed, is to actually make this a grid container. So display grid, and now you will see this making effect. And yeah, we already have now our 4 column tracks and our 4 row tracks as well. Let's just give them some gap so we can see it. So grid gap, 30 pixels. Okay, so you see our 7 grid items here, but we don't see the rest of the rows and the column tracks, right? So let's just inspect this here, such as we did before. And so this is the layout tab here, and so we can now select here the challenge grid container, which is the one here that we're working on. So you see it down here is a representation of the grid that we have. And so here, remember, the rows are 100, 200, 400, and 100. And that's what we can see here. So this is the 100 row 200, 400, which is much bigger, and then 100. And you see that they are down here. So we see these empty grid cells, which were actually created with our grid track declaration. We just don't have enough grid items to fill all of these cells up. But don't worry, we're gonna care about that right now, okay? So let's start by positioning our grid items exactly in the cells that we want them to be. So the first thing to do is to make the header span all the way from the first column line to the last one, right? So how do we do that? Well, let's just select the header, and then we can use grid column. So we start with number 1, and then remember the trick that we have to go all the way to the end of the grid. So we could just write span over 4 columns, right? But I prefer to do it like this, as I showed you in the last lecture. So from 1 to -1, and so now we have the header going across the entire grid from left to right, okay? So that part is already done. And notice that we don't actually have to declare the grid row property here, because the automatic placement algorithm takes care of putting the header right in the first line, because it's actually the first element here in a markup as well. So that's automatically placed here, and we don't have to declare it. And the same actually applies to our small boxes here. They're also already exactly where they should be. And so we don't have to do anything, because automatic placement again puts them where we want them to be, okay? So the next thing that we have then to worry about is just the sidebar. So the sidebar should be here in this cell, but not only this cell. So remember that it actually spans across these 2 cells here, right? So the sidebar should be starting here and then go across these 2 cells, with the main content then occupying this entire space here on this left side. Okay? So let's code that up very quick. And I'm not really sure why this grid overlay is actually overlaying here this entire CodePen editor. I'm sure that's not really correct, but it's probably just a bug in Firefox right now. So it's not a big deal. All right, so let's worry about the sidebar. And that's actually not correct. So sidebar. So grid column, where is it? It starts, as you can see here, on number 4. So 4 to 5. And we could have used -1 here again to go all the way to the end, but in this case, it's I guess it's not really necessary. So you have the sidebar right here now, but it's not yet exactly where we want it. We want it to be here beginning on line number 2, right? So grid row, it should go from 2 and then span across 2 cells. So span 2. And that's it. You see? So now it starts here at the top and goes down here. And this is actually all a bit too big, so I have to do all the scrolling up and down. Let me just zoom out a bit. But then actually the code also becomes too small to see probably. But just to get a big overview here of our entire grid, you can see that it's already taking shape and becoming more like what we want in the end. So next what we have to do is to just make this main content here span these 3 cells, and then in the end finally put the footer down here, which also shouldn't be all too hard. Putting it back to its original size, and then let's move on. So main content, and now all we have to do here is to define the column, because the row is actually already correct, right? So you can see that it's already in a correct row, and so all we have to do is to manipulate the position in the column. So it's gonna start at number 1, and then I could write once more that it goes to all the way until number 4, but I think it's more intuitive to simply say that it spans across 3 tracks or 3 cells. Okay, and so yeah, that's already looking good. So the main content is now exactly in the place where it should be, and now all there's left to do is to also position the footer. And nothing's easier than that. Grid column, and it's just like the header, so 1 all the way to -1. And yeah, That's it. So that's all we have to do. It's as simple as this. You see? Just a couple of lines of CSS to build this great layout that would have been so complex to build with the old school float layouts, like we've been doing for way too long actually. So let me zoom out here again to see it in its full glory, right? So yeah, so that's the final result, and I really hope that you achieved to do it by yourself. But again, if you did not, don't worry about it. It's no problem. Now remember that I said in one of the earlier lectures that there are multiple ways of positioning grid items in the grid. And so I want to use this example to demonstrate you the different ways of doing exactly that. So there are basically two more ways that I want to show you. And this example is actually, it's really perfect for that, okay? So in the two next videos, I'm going to show you two different ways which you can also use to position grid items on the grid. So stay tuned for that.